So because methane is a loss of energy for the animal, and through the ruminant nutritionists, we've been studying methane for decades. It's not just a recent phenomenon with global warming and climate change and greenhouse gases. And so we know a lot about that, and we know there are several feed additives that we can use to reduce methane. So a good example is feeding polyunsaturated fatty acids, because the microbes in the rumen will saturate those fatty acids with hydrogens, and that becomes a hydrogen sink, pulling hydrogens away from the methane pathway. Problem is, we can only feed a limited amount of those before we start to have negative effects on the animals' feed intake and performance and things like that.
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Maureen Olevnik, Coordinator of Global Food Systems. Well, today I would like to welcome Dr. Phillip Lancaster to the podcast. Phillip, could you start by giving us a little background and information on who you are and what brought you to the area of study that you are in and what brought you to K-State?
Thank you, Maureen. I think starting back when I was growing up, I grew up on a farm, had livestock, and we raised crops and stuff as well. And so when I decided to go to college, I was interested in agriculture, and I went to Western Illinois University, and there it's an agricultural science degree. So you get a broad mix of agronomy classes and livestock classes and other stuff. And so beef cattle and just the nutrition of the animal being able to be so varied and be able to utilize so many different feedstuffs and things like that because of the rumen just really kind of piqued my interest. So after bachelor's degree, I went and worked at a small feedlot in Illinois for a little while, a couple of years, and there I interacted with the consulting nutritionist and thought that was pretty cool, and decided I wanted to go back to grad school, and originally thought that's what I was going to do, was go into consulting and be working at feedlots. And then I got into my master's degree at University of Missouri, and realized that I really like solving problems. I really like the research aspect and digging into stuff like that. And so I decided to go on for my PhD. Got my doctorate at Texas A&M University in there. And so then after that, I was pretty much looking at academic jobs. I didn't spend much time looking at industry jobs. Ended up at Oklahoma State for a postdoc, and spent 5 years there in nutrition and muscle biology type of interaction stuff in beef cattle. And then took a faculty position at the University of Florida for a few years. And then my wife and I, we wanted to get back to the Midwest a little. We didn't like South Florida that much. And so we ended up taking teaching jobs at Missouri State University for a few years. And then jobs here at Kansas State opened up. And so we applied for jobs here and came here to Kansas State University in the fall of 2019.
Yeah, you have seen a few things in your background on how things are taught and
different places
absolutely.
And several different ways of managing cattle in different regions and geographies and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of neat to be able to, because so in class, I can talk to them about how things are different in different parts of the country and things like that. And so, like for an example, I teach a beef cattle sustainability class to veterinary students. It's an elective, and we got a student in there from Florida. And so I made a comment the other day in class about we get most of our rain through the fall and winter. And he said, well, it depends on where you're at. And I said, oh, yeah, where you're at, it's from June to October. And so just being able to relate to them, because I've been in several different places and situations. So how animals use energy. There's different steps in the conversion of feed energy to usable energy in the animal. And so with just the feed itself, we use the term gross energy. It's just if you combust all the organic material in that feed, and that is the amount of total calories in that feed. Then the animal digests it, and then you have the digestible energy, because 100% of those organic material is not digestible. And then in ruminants, we lose a portion of that to methane, which is an energy loss to the animal. But it's it's an important process as far as rumen fermentation goes, as far as a hydrogen sink and not managing acidification of the rumen. And then from that point, we have what we call metabolizable energy, and that's the energy that's available for work to the animal. And then the animal uses it different ways. Some of it goes just to maintain the animal's current physiological state and size. Some of it is used for growth of muscle and fat tissue. Some of it is used for pregnancy if it's a female. And some of it is used for lactation if it's a lactating female. And so all those conversion steps are what we call energy metabolism. And so we have done, my dissertation work was on feed efficiency. And so you're looking at gross pounds of feed to gross conversion of pounds of calf or pounds of muscle and meat, however far you want to take that. And so, but is the animal really using the energy in that feed more efficiently, or is it just a change in the composition of the animal, so to speak, or a change in the digestibility because an animal is consuming more, which means it passes through their digestive tract faster and they digest less of it. And so what I wanted to get at is, are we really finding animals that are actually using energy more efficiently as opposed to just gross feed efficiency?
So to paraphrase, you're saying that not every step in that process actually results in energy conversion that leads to growth of the animal. And you want to make sure that you're improving that conversion that does lead to efficient use for the animal.
Yes. And so the animal could divert different proportions of that energy to maintenance versus growth.
Right. And
so we want to find the animals that divert a larger proportion of it to growth, those kind of things. And really, and if you get down to the biochemical level, is there a difference in, say, the mitochondrial function of those animals and their ability to use that energy as opposed to burning it into CO2?
So what are you finding? Is there a difference at the mitochondrial level of whether or not?
So there is, but the interesting thing about the research that's been done is that we've always looked at feeding animals on an ad libitum basis, because that's how we feed beef cattle. We don't limit the amount of feed that they get. And so when we've looked at those animals that eat more for their size and growth are less efficient, and their mitochondria seem to be less efficient.
Interesting.
But there hasn't been any real research to separate out whether that's really an efficiency of use, or if that is just because they're chugging more calories through the system, so to speak. There's research in rodents that suggests caloric intake has an effect on the efficiency of mitochondrial function.
And not necessarily a good efficiency, right?
No, high, caloric restriction is actually a little better, makes the mitochondria a little more efficient. And so that's one of my questions, is what we're seeing a difference in the animal's really genetic ability, or is it just a function of consuming more calories? Or less calories in this case would be more efficient, sorry.
And that's what you were studying in your dissertation, and you continue to study in different ways today?
Yeah.
Yeah. You must be making some kind of incremental steps to solving that puzzle.
Well, we've done some stuff. Here at Kansas State, I've shifted gears a little bit, just because of the resources that I have and where I'm at now. It's a little bit more of a modeling work and trying to look at with published data sets and what are the differences and what's going on there, whereas I don't have the direct access to animal facilities as much as I used to.
Interesting.
So when you on your website talked about sustainable production, where does it begin in the scope of what you're looking at? Where does it begin? Where does it end when you are thinking about sustainability? So, for example, I know the USDA had a big research program on feed efficiency in different crops, sorghum, maize, things like that. So you can start it pretty far back, and then you could take it out to marketing, basically. But what's the reasonable scope for the way you look at sustainability?
Well, if I look at sustainability, I look at it pretty broadly, and with different components. And from the animal production side, particularly with beef cattle, a lot of from at least the environmental sustainability component is related to feed production or feed use by the animal. So most of those environmental issues are nitrous oxide from fertilizing crops and pastures, and methane production from feed digestion by the animal. Those are the two biggest, from a greenhouse gas perspective, the two biggest components by far. And so if we can make that conversion more efficient, then we are reducing the carbon footprint of a pound of beef.
So on scale, though, so you have pasture versus feedlot.
Mm-hmm.
How does that factor in? I mean, you could spend a lot of time identifying breeding lines of cattle that are, more efficient in that conversion.
Mm-hmm.
But does that get overridden if you place them in a feedlot situation as opposed to pasture?
Yeah, Jim, you're on a good point there, that there's a difference in the efficiency of animals on grass versus in the feedlot. And from this metric that we've been using to measure feed efficiency, there's a positive relationship, but it's not very strong. And so animals that are more efficient on a high forage type of diet are not necessarily the ones that are most efficient on a high grain type of diet. And so diet does seem to impact how those animals rank. And so we still don't really know the biology of why those change. We think some of it's due to rumen microbiome, but it also may be differences in their metabolism of using different substrates from that fermentation process.
Phillip, this is really blowing my mind because it's coming home for me how many variables are involved here if we want to think about carbon footprint per pound of meat. I have heard somewhat anecdotally in the past that you can't assume that beef produced in a free-range environment is necessarily of lower impact, even though you were talking about some of these impacts from raising the grain, because of the additional time that it takes for cattle to fatten on grass. So now you're telling me it even depends on what breed potentially you have in which one of those environments could make a difference.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
very much so. So you're correct that cattle don't gain as much weight per day on grass, and so it takes longer to get them to an appropriate size and fatness that we typically like to consume that meat. And so it takes longer for them to get there, and so you've got a bigger impact just because of time. And there's a trade-off between different aspects too, in that cattle in the feedlot produce less methane per pound of beef than cattle on pasture, but we probably have a little bit more water quality issues and nitrous oxide emissions and things like that because we use a lot more fertilizer for the grain production than we do in pasture situation. And so there's a trade-off there, and trying to balance this, and how do you get at balancing all these different things. And from a sustainability standpoint, it really comes down to how do you define sustainability, and how do you measure it and put all the components together into something that we can say this is more sustainable than this. And it has been a very elusive thing to do there, and it's very subjective about whether this practice is more sustainable than this other practice.
Back to the question of where do you start and end sustainability, and what do you include in the modeling?
Yeah, that was the essence of the question. It wasn't to pick on you.
No,
it was to identify just how difficult this really is, and the challenge is finding some metrics that will give us an idea that we're actually making progress, and that's harder to do than it might sound.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about the extra amount of time that it takes to feed out a grass-fed cow and the negative impact that has, is the negative impact, other than possibly getting a more rapid turnaround of income for the producer, is that, you mentioned that nitrous oxide and methane are the two major, is it because of the extra methane that's produced over that length of time? Is that, that is the key right now?
That is a big key to that factor, or to that production system.
Okay.
And so there's a question, how impactful is that? Because a new measure of global warming potential, they call it global warming potential, or GWP star, is a different way of estimating the global warming potential of different gases, and particularly makes a difference with methane, because methane is a relatively short-lived gas in the atmosphere. And so instead of methane just accumulating over year after year after year, there is a life cycle of about 10 to 12 years where that methane is converted to CO2 in the atmosphere, and then obviously taken up by plants again, and so there's a cycle there. And so this GWP star is a different way to calculate that global warming potential, taking into effect the short lifespan of methane. And so if you get to the idea would be that since it's such a short cycle, if you get to a stable level of production, then after about a decade, it would balance itself out and we would be in equilibrium. So if we can get to a stable, so that's kind of the goal of the beef industry, the dairy industry, some of these net zero type of promises that they're making, is that we could get to a stable situation and be in equilibrium where we're not adding additional global warming potential to the atmosphere. And that comes through some different ways. Some of it is through reducing production, and some of it is through increasing capture in soil carbon and things like that.
If I could demonstrate my shallow understanding of livestock production, but something I've wondered, and this may be insane, but if we can detach the deal with ethics issues another time. So if we just treat animals as production units, it seems like the goal, a desirable goal, is to have a lot of yield per individual. So we want big animals. Mm-hmm. But if the ultimate goal is marketable meat, would there be any sustainability benefit to raising more animals, harvesting them earlier, than to try to maximize the pounds of meat per animal? Does the question make sense?
Yes, I understand. Yeah, I understand I think what you're saying. And if we look at the historical pounds of beef produced per animal, that kind of plays into that, answers that question, in that we have improved or increased the amount of meat per animal that we have produced. And over that same time, we've decreased the amount of greenhouse gases per pound of beef. And the reason for that, that I'm thinking about right now, is that maintenance energy component that we talked about. So that cow that's out there on pasture, that's the breeding unit, 80% of what she eats is just to maintain herself. And she's eating that all year round. And so what we need to do is get as many pounds of beef per breeding cow as possible to make our system as most efficient as possible. And so that brings in reproduction, that brings in size of the animal and the amount of meat we can get per animal, because those cows generally have one calf per cow per year. It's not like pigs or sheep that are having multiple offspring per birth. So that means that we have to get as much pounds of beef per animal as we can. And that's where increasing the size of the animals has made our system more efficient, because we're getting more meat for each one of those cows that's out there.
Philip, will you go back? I want to come back to this larger model that we're talking about, just trying to figure out, what things we should be changing to make the biggest reduction in carbon impact. But I guess it never occurred to me that the reason that we have this methane impact from cattle production is because of ruminant action. Can you just do a quick and dirty review of the chemistry there of why is it that cattle produce methane and why is that bad? So
it has to do with the breakdown of carbohydrates. So if we let's go back to biochem, a glucose molecule has 6 carbons. And so when the microbes in the rumen ferment that, there are basically 2 products the major products that come from that. One is acetic acid, and the other one is propionic acid. So, and depending on the species of bacteria and really the rate of fermentation makes an impact. And so the faster the fermentation, we tend to increase the acidity of the rumen, and so that it tends to select for microbes that produce propionic acid, which that's what happens in a grain diet situation. We get more propionic acid relative to acetic acid. If in a slower fermentation and we maintain a higher rumen pH, we tend to select for those microbes that produce more acetic acid. And so what you would think, if I have a glucose molecule that has 6 carbons, I will get 3 acetic acid molecules, but I don't. I only get 2. And because of the biochemical pathway, one of those carbons is metabolized to carbon dioxide. And so that carbon dioxide then is used by methanogens in the rumen to capture hydrogens and then convert CO2 to methane. And those microbes are getting their energy to grow from that breakdown of glucose to acetic and propionic acid. The methanogens are getting their energy to grow from conversion of CO2 to methane. And so all that niche of all those microbes and that microbiome in the rumen and how all those work together is how we end up with that methane production.
Great, thank you. Visual aid would have been great, but you explained it very, very well. Thank you.
They can't see it.
Right.
Well, you had been involved in a seed grant, a Global Food System seed grant recently, and have some very interesting results. And I was excited when you brought the idea and the proposal to us, because you're looking at waste, food waste, which is not just an animal problem. Clearly, it is a human problem, and it's a worldwide issue. But trying to come up with ways of utilizing just regular food waste. Can you give us a little background on what that project was and maybe some information on how it ended, what results you got?
So the idea of the project started with trying to figure out ways to utilize food waste as a livestock feed, and really trying to see if we could use it as a ruminant livestock feed. And there are some limitations to that based on the type of food waste, because we can't feed ruminant animal products back to ruminants. And so we have to pretty much stick with the vegetable component of that if we're going to ruminants. So the first project we did was to look at separating waste streams at the dining hall here on campus, where we collect the vegetable prep waste in one stream and the stuff coming from the dining hall in a second stream. And so could we use those as two separate streams, one going to ruminants and one going to monogastric animals? And so we looked at the nutritional value of those different streams. We looked at the variability, and that's one of the big issues with food waste, is the variability in nutrient composition. And so it makes it really difficult to incorporate that into a livestock diet, because it's going to change a lot from batch to batch that I get, which means that either I have to test every batch and reformulate my diet all the time, or I'm going to have periods where the animal is not getting the amount of nutrients that it needs, and then periods where it's getting too much. And so that becomes a real problem, especially in swine and poultry type of diets, because they are fed much more precisely than ruminant animals, particularly beef cows. And so my idea was a beef cow, she's got a lot of flexibility. She doesn't have to have such a precise nutrient delivery every day, and so some fluctuation is not necessarily such a big issue for her. And so that's where kind of that idea came from, that we could look at that as a potential source in beef cattle diets, and particularly in cow-calf situations, which we have cow-calf production in all 50 states. And so whereas opposed to like our feedlot production is pretty much all in the Great Plains. And so we would be able to move those food waste streams to cattle that are in close proximity to where those food waste streams are generated.
Interesting. So you've got flexibility with your cows, and you can. What happened with the other types of animals, or did you try it on other types of animal feeds?
In that project, we did not get to actually feed it to any livestock. The second project, we collected just the food waste from the dining center, and then we're looking at using it in a couple of ways in poultry diets. And so one way is to use it just raw, the way it is, but then another way that we're looking at using it is using it as a fermentation substrate with a yeast that produces an antioxidant called astaxanthin. And this antioxidant is really powerful, and it's actually used in poultry production to increase the antioxidant in the egg yolk and protect the egg yolk from oxidation and things like that. And so we thought that, okay, will that add value to food waste? Because one of the issues with converting food waste to livestock feed is it's got to compete with the other feed ingredients that are usually cheaper to produce. And so the issue with food waste is that I'm collecting a very wet product that either requires a lot of energy to dry, or I can only transport it very short distances because I'm moving a lot of water. And so we thought, okay, this might be a way to add value to that process so that it becomes more economical for a company to invest in that and utilize food waste in some form that then avoids going to the landfill. So from that study, we've gotten some data back on the variability of the food stream. Again, we looked at that, and we're looking at how effectively it can be used as a raw product in poultry diets. We're getting the results back now on digestibility of the raw product and the fermentation product in poultry, and how the amino acid digestibility and the energy digestibility of those products. And then we've got the performance trial going on right now, where we're growing the birds. And one of the other things about that astaxanthin product that one of our microbiologists was interested in, he thinks it may be a decent antimicrobial. And so we're looking at whether it has an impact on Salmonella and Campylobacter in the poultry.
For someone who's never seen how these kinds of tests are run, the performance trials, that makes sense to me. I understand how you're running those. But the energy digestibility, how do you test whether or not there's a certain amount of energy in a particular amount of either one of those conditions?
So we measure the amount of energy in the original product by combustion. Okay, and so we measure.
Do you literally burn it?
Yes,
wow.
You do. At a very high temperature in a very controlled little, what we call a bomb calorimeter, and we measure the heat produced, which is a measure of the caloric value or a caloric content of it, and then we feed it to the animal, and we collect the feces at the end, and we do the same thing. And so we know the difference between what was consumed and what was excreted, and that's the energy digestibility. And we do the same thing with the amino acids. So we do an amino acid profile of the feed, and we do an amino acid profile of the, in this case, we do it at the ileum instead of the cloaca. And so now we've got an amino acid digestibility of that feed product as well. And that's very important in poultry production to formulate diets to meet amino acid requirements, because we formulate diets for poultry on an amino acid basis, not just a total protein basis.
I see. Thank you for explaining that. I'm thinking about the research assistants and their work. I can see that it's not always a fun job necessarily.
No.
You started out by saying, I like solving problems. There's a global level problem that you're trying to solve with your work. There must be researchers like you all over the world who are trying to figure out what are the right inputs, what are the right variables that we control. How do you all work together? Is it just the traditional kind of journal publications, or is there a way that Kansas State is involved in some larger consortium that's trying to put this model together for how do we figure out what's the best way to feed cattle to reduce carbon impact?
So from an academic research perspective, there's not a global or a national organization that I know. We're going through the normal academic channels. Mm-hmm. But from an industry-wide perspective, which Kansas State participates in, there's a couple organizations. One is called the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which looks at taking the research that's out there, building education modules for producers, they fund some small pilot projects that will look at trying different things through the food supply chain. They were instrumental in defining what sustainability in the beef industry really is. And then there's a global roundtable for sustainable beef. And then there's the same types of organizations for dairy, pork, other livestock species. So look at what does this mean for our industry? How do we get a handle around it? Because it's a very abstract kind of idea. And how do we put some legs to it to help the people in our industry show improvement?
Yeah, no, that's great. So what you're saying is there's sort of these industry groups that are in between academics and the producer that are trying to synthesize and collect this information.
Yeah, and those groups are generally producer-led, but there are producer groups like the Kansas Livestock Association that are part of those. There are NGOs like the Nature Conservancy that are part of those. There are the corporations like Cargill and McDonald's and Walmart that are part of those, have a representative on those. So they've done a really good job of bringing together all the players in the industry to have those conversations. And what does this mean, not just at the ranch level or whatever, what's it mean throughout the whole production chain, and how does one thing in one sector impact other sectors?
Over the last, say, 10 years, 12 years in science in general, there's been this tremendous interest in the microbiome and, understanding its role in health issues, plants, animals, humans, across the board, but environmental regulation of various nutrient cycles, things like that. So I'm wondering, so it's not just to understand, it's can we influence? Mm-hmm. So I'm now back thinking about the methane issue. And just from your experience, is there any chance that we might ultimately influence the intestinal flora to the point where we're not getting methane production, maybe sequester the carbon dioxide somehow or shunt it, if we could displace the methanogenic bacteria and, capitalize on the CO2 itself before it ever gets to methane? Is that like off the charts or do you think that's within our range?
So because methane is a loss of energy for the animal, and through the ruminant nutritionists, we've been studying methane for decades. It's not just a recent phenomenon with global warming and climate change and greenhouse gases. And so we know a lot about that, and we know there are several feed additives that we can use to reduce methane. So a good example is feeding polyunsaturated fatty acids, because the microbes in the rumen will saturate those fatty acids with hydrogens, and that becomes a hydrogen sink, pulling hydrogens away from the methane pathway. Problem is, we can only feed a limited amount of those before we start to have negative effects on the animals' feed intake and performance and things like that. There's a lot of research going on now on some new products in both synthetic and natural at looking at reducing methane emissions. There are, I don't want to give out company names, but there's a company that has a product that is approved in Canada and Europe, I think, and they're working on approval in the U.S. That will reduce methane emissions when you including it in the feed.
So is this like a Activia for cattle, or?
It's not a probiotic. This is just a chemical compound. But there are some people that are also looking at probiotics and see if that makes an impact. There's also work being done on the genetics. There's a genetic component to the rumen microbiome. The genetics of the animal influence the rumen microbiome. And so there's some work being done. Can we genetically select for animals that produce less methane? And there's definitely variation among animals. And it seems to be heritable to some degree. The heritability estimates that I've seen are not extremely strong, but there is a heritability to it. And so can we select for animals that produce less methane? And one of the questions I've got about that is, are we selecting animals that just have less methanogens, or are we selecting animals that are particularly digesting their feed less, and so they're not producing as much methane just because they're not digesting as much feed?
Which would counteract what you're really going for in terms of efficiency. Yeah.
Yes, it would.
Stepping back to the seed grant that you worked on a minute ago when you were talking about industry involvement and groups working together, on campus, when you put this seed grant together, you worked with a variety of people well outside of your area of study. Can you kind of give us some background on the group of people that you worked with on this and what value that interdisciplinary connection brought to the program that you were working on?
So we had people from dining services who understand and know the food service industry and what is capable of happening from a logistics standpoint, and knowing and their menu information and all that kind of stuff, so that we have an idea of what types of things went into that waste stream and things like that. And so they're obviously instrumental for letting us get in there and collect the waste, but then also just helping us understand, okay, what's feasible. And then myself, being a ruminant nutritionist, I have not done much with poultry. In fact, big fat zero. And so I recruited somebody from Grain Science who is got a background in monogastric nutrition, has done some poultry. And so he was instrumental in, okay, how do we do these digestibility studies and these performance studies? And then another person in my department that is a microbiologist and particularly focuses on food pathogen stuff. And so he was interested in the antimicrobial properties of the astaxanthin. And then also then for the astaxanthin component, we recruited a fermentation chemist who was working in some areas sort of like this, but this was a little different direction. And so that we could look at not just get the fermentation product done, but what's the yield of the astaxanthin, what's the appropriate process to get the highest yield from that food waste.
That's a big team. And with a lot of moving parts and a lot of different people. It's a really cool idea, and I can't wait to find out what your results are. The idea that waste from the dining halls was going back to feed chickens in the farm unit up to the north, I assume. That is a really, really cool idea.
Yeah, I thought so. I'd written down I don't know, are you familiar with Dr. John Day M. in civil engineering?
No, I'm not.
You might want to. We did do a podcast with him in the past, but he's done a lot of work on food waste in the dump and looking at the microbiological impact on the food waste that's going in there. He's got some very interesting research that he was involved in, and I don't think he worked with anybody else. Well, he must have if he was on a seed grant. I don't remember who. He works mostly with engineering, but that's kind of what we're trying to do, is push these groups together so they understand, because I think that some of his work might be of interest to you. I think what he started out looking at was not necessarily food waste, but his wife lives in Texas, and he would be driving that drive all the time and seeing those big, huge hay bales. And it just occurred to him at one point that there's got to be some microbiological activity going on in those bales, and he was curious as to what kind of gases were being produced off of that, and there's a lot. I mean, his research showed that there's quite a bit, but he's got some interesting work going as well.
Yeah, a lot of bales are actually treated with propionic acid to slow down the microbial activity, not lose some of the feed value that occurs when they're sitting out in the field. So where do your students usually go? So I'm guessing you have students coming through the program, and where do they go to make a difference in the world? So here at Kansas State, I have the first graduate student from this seed grant would be the first one that I've had here that would be graduating next semester. And through this project, she was originally thinking of going to industry, but now she decided to go on for a PhD. She's gotten interested in this. She wants to do more nutrition stuff. She came through undergrad with a grain science degree and feed manufacturing and stuff, and then kind of gotten more into nutrition through this process and wants to go into nutrition for work for her PhD, which will be a very good combination of things for her to understand the feed manufacturing side and then the animal nutrition component to it. The other students that have
have a student that will be starting in January in a very different area, but still related to sustainability as far as looking at liver abscesses in feedlot cattle. And that's a whole different type of sustainability, as it relates very strongly to antimicrobial resistance. We use, to try to control the rate of liver abscesses, we use a antimicrobial in the feed, and it's the largest use of antimicrobials in beef production. And so there's a big push to find alternatives. The same microbiologist that I worked with on the seed grant is also working on antimicrobial alternatives in that area, and we've got some proposals out to try to get some funding to get some work going in that area. From my perspective, I'm interested. We know there's some nutritional components to that process, that pathological process, and so I want to dive more into the nutrition and the management side of it and how that impacts the prevalence of liver abscess in feedlot cattle.
I was just imagining that industry would certainly be interested in what you're doing for a whole variety of reasons, but I would think that would be a logical place for your students to seek.
Yeah. So, and one thing with a lot of our students with the Beef Cattle Institute, because we're in the College of Veterinary Medicine, a lot of our students are dual degree DVM masters or dual degree DVM PhD, and so they're interested in veterinary type of careers. That may be industry, but maybe a little bit more research oriented, R&D type of positions, or even academia, with that graduate degree added on to their DVM.
Well, we are coming upon the hour. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we wrap
problem.
this up, do you have questions for us or comments that you'd like to share? Something that we missed?
No, well, one thing I was going to go back to, you kind of mentioned how to put all the sustainability stuff together. And a project that I just finished up for the Beef Checkoff, we did some modeling, but then we looked at, okay, how could you try to combine the people, profit, planet pillars all together into a single value, numerical value, that then you could rank production practices. And so there's a subjective component to it, and then also an objective component to it, where we looked at the objective component is the ranking or the production of, say, greenhouse gases, or the soil carbon sequestered, or the nitrogen lost from the system, or whatever, and how those production systems rank, or production practices rank on those different metrics. And then we used a panel of experts in agronomy, animal production, economics, wildlife, and biology to give an importance score to each one of those metrics. And so then we could combine those metrics based on where those production systems ranked, and then based on the importance score. And so then we put that together and weighted each pillar equally, and then came up with a single value to rank different production systems.
That sounds like a really useful tool. Is that available in some kind of public-facing forum, or is that published research, or how's?
It's not published yet. There is, I think you can get to the report on beefresearch.org, or you will be able to at some point. But I got the idea from, I found a paper where they were doing an environmental assessment of a shopping mall going in somewhere, and they had these different metrics of environmental impact, and they asked experts on how do they think this shopping mall is going to impact these different indicators or metrics of environmental impact, and then they the experts gave it an important score, and they gave it a rank, and they combined all that into a value of the overall environmental impact of the shopping center going in or whatever. And so I kind of took that idea and morphed it a little bit for our situation, and so we'll see what reviewers think of it when we go to publish.
I've got one last sort of
absolutely.
like really big question. It might not seem like a question we need to ask when we're sitting here in the middle of beef production country, and the work that you do is obviously solving problems for folks in industry, but also planet. But I can imagine someone listening to this conversation and thinking, wow, there are less intensive ways in terms of the planet's resources to produce protein. Why are we going to all of this trouble to study how to reduce the planetary impact of beef production? Why don't we just grow protein for us some other way? How would you answer that question?
Yes, we can grow protein other ways. Plant protein is obviously the main alternative. But there's trade-offs. Growing plants is not necessarily environmentally free. Everything has an impact. And the protein quality of meat or beef in general is much higher than plant protein because of the difference in amino acid profile and meeting those amino acid needs of people. And then so that's an important component. And then from a land use perspective, in the U.S., I think it's about 29% of the land in the U.S. is in rangeland and pasture land. And in the world, it's about 40%. And so that land that's growing cellulose that humans cannot digest, it would not be used because it's generally not arable land. And so we're using cattle and ruminants, other ruminants across the world, to harvest that feed resource and convert it to a product that we can consume and that's highly nutritious for people.
Great.
And so if you look at the way we feed beef cattle now in the U.S., a lot of people have the impression that we are feeding a lot of corn. But right now, a lot of our corn is actually grown for ethanol production, and we're feeding the byproduct. And so only about 10% of the animal's diet is actually corn. And all beef cattle are consuming forage for at least 50% of their lifetime.
Great, thank you. I assume that that 40% of the world's land that's not tillable also serves as some kind of carbon sink if it's not being tilled, right? So, I mean, there's benefits to using that cellulose that we can't process in our bodies, also for the planet in terms of carbon sequestration.
Yeah, if managed well, there can be carbon sequestered there. And Jim, you might have a better understanding of this than I do because I'm not a soil scientist. But my understanding is that there's kind of a maximum soil carbon content of different soil types in different regions. And once we reach that maximum, we're not going to improve much above that. And so kind of depends on the state that the soil is currently in, what's our potential to sequester carbon in those soils. And so from my understanding, because we have plowed cropland and released a lot of that carbon, the potential to store carbon per acre is a lot higher in cropland. But because rangelands and pasture lands are such a large land mass, the total amount of carbon that could be sequestered from a global perspective is larger with rangeland and pasture land.
Interesting.
Good. Great. Anything else? Anything else we missed?
No, I just thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, it was fun.
I really appreciate it.
Thank
yeah.
you.
It was fun.
Thank you so much.
You guys
Yeah.
asked good questions. I really wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know how detailed we were going to get, and so.
See, that's
yeah.
why we put you guys back against the wall. You can't run. No, these have
thanks.
been fun, but thank you
you.
so much. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at ksu.edu/research/global food and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Gowen's album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.